Well, that should work out okay, that one. So, let's pack this up. And let's think about what's next. Okay. Okay, so tonight's game, Sunless Citadel. Ah, yeah, this is where we are. Well, that might be a problem. Okay, on to the next project. Well, on the morning after the editing and posting of my lava terrain video to YouTube, I realised that my gaming group, who are currently running through the Sunless Citadel, have just entered the Grove level, and I have no terrain that suits that kind of scenario. So with literally just an afternoon to put something together, I settled on the mushroom growths that are being farmed by Belak and his cohorts. I decided I wanted to have big mushrooms simply because I wanted a fairly dominant terrain that the players could engage with, albeit online through a camera. So, with very few materials to hand for this and very little time, this is a real speed build, which turned out to be pretty successful, I think, given the quantity of pieces I made and how well they sort of dominated the less polished terrain that contained them. So scrap EVA foam and aluminium foil, tin foil, is the core of the materials for this. So it doesn't really matter what type of foam you were to use. I obviously use a lot of EVA foam, so that I always have scrap pieces of that to hand. The simple thing is just providing a base onto which to house the mushrooms themselves, and I wanted to make sure that these were usable in all sorts of environments, be that an alien environment on a battle board for 40k, as well as here a sort of Underdark subterranean network of chambers in which these things are being farmed. So here we go. I am just basically creating a rocky base from the EVA foam, just scraps of foam, and then I'm using the tinfoil crumpled up and sort of mashed into areas which will provide this sort of fungal growth area that the mushrooms are going to grow from. Pretty straightforward. Nice and quick. Just when you're hot melt gluing the tin foil to the foam, the heat of the hot melt glue does transfer through the aluminium. So handle with care, as they say. Anyway, here we go. On to the next bit. I've got to say, there's a marked difference between the rock texture you can carve out of XPS, albeit the fact I've never been able to use XPS, and what you can get out of EVA foam. So I think the difference with carving rocky textures out of EVA foam is to remember to slice and tear the pieces off. You'll get a more rugged like texture. and then use the pieces that are the small slivers that you carve off, which are very durable. You can kind of glue those back on in a more random fashion, and this will give you a good rocky texture. And you'll see that being used more effectively in one of my modular terrain builds that should be coming out pretty soon. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm just taking the knife, slicing into the EVA foam at the edges, and then tearing the chunks off, making sure to save the bits that I tear off. And then once I'm happy with the general carving, as I say, I take some of those torn off chunks and I glue those back on randomly to create a more varied rocky texture. And I think this works with a good effect once the later texture additions are also made. Okay, we're onto the shrooms themselves. So my idea here is to make sure that they're good and stable, is to force some barbecue skewers down through the foil directly into the foam, and these will make sure that the stalk, the stem of the mushroom itself, which is going to be quite tall, has a good amount of stability to it. Pretty straightforward process. Shoving the barbecue skewers in, doing them at different lengths so that I get varying heights and angles as well, you know, so they're growing out oddly, not all at the same angle. And then I just hot melt glue all of these so that they're nice and firm in there and they're not likely to pull back out later on. As I say, I've made several of these, so you're going to see different ones as I'm filming, just for the convenience at that time of me filming. But the next step is to form the actual stem of the shroom around the barbecue skewer. Again, using tin foil, as I say, the primary material for this whole build is tin foil. And when you really pack tin foil down, it does really get a firm solidity to it, as you'll see in a short time when I'm doing the heads themselves. But yeah, just wrapping this around, just making sure that there's a bit of girth to it, trying to get it so that it's a bit wider at the base than at the top, just for a more natural lead into the shroom head itself. And then using the hot melt glue gun, just running a ragged texture all over the foil. This will help to just bond all of that foil in place, but it'll go on to give the appearance of veins of some description running up and down the stems, and it'll help at the fungal level at the base as well. So my first thought for the mushroom caps was to roll up a piece of kitchen foil and then sort of bash it into shape, making sure that it was good and solid and compact. And this worked out pretty well, although I feel that I lost a certain amount of roundness to the cap because of the way I was bashing it down, and once that foil was compacted, it was very difficult to get that roundness back. So I use the nearest sharp pointy thing to make sure that I've got an indent, a place to hold when I attach this to the end of the barbecue skewer on the main base. Good dollop of hot melt glue, and that's fits on there quite nicely. It stays quite sturdy and rigid. So that was a reasonable first start to that way of making the cap. Then I tried another way, something that maybe would give me a rounder cap shape, and that was to roll a ball solidly of foil and then attempt to slice it in two. First of all with a knife, which it was far too compact and too difficult, so then I transferred over to my handsaw, and that cut through no problem. My thinking here is I get two caps for the price of one process, But again, this only worked on a smaller size head, although it did work quite well. Completely the same process of attachment. Dig a small hole, something for the peg to grip onto, hot glue and push it on there to hold it in place. My third and final method of creating the cap head was to roll into the center a sheet of aluminium foil, and so you create this sort of lip, leaving the actual cap not too thick so that can still be molded into a nice dome of whatever depth desired. And then to take a second piece of foil which you kind of mash into a cone, which you then glue into the underside of that domed piece. So now you've got two separate pieces glued together. And this was definitely the most successful way of making the cap heads, and it's the way I went on to make all of the remaining cap heads, and I think it gave more detailing as well. So I was pleased with this third and final method. Alas, I only had gloss black spray paint, and so the 7 of these that I've made got a hit with black gloss paint. Hands down, one of the fastest drying, wide coverage adhesives you can use for small particle matter is hairspray, and cheap hairspray at that. It will bond pretty much any kind of flock that you want to use, and it dries in minutes, so it really is a go-to. And if you give it a few coats, or at least one coat afterwards, it really will withstand the test of time. The two particle materials that I'm using on the bases of these in this early stage is this, it's a remnant from drilling out a piece of aquarium bogwood. So it's like a bark that's been finely chipped and chopped, but it has a more rugged texture than my vermiculite, which is what I'm using here. Vermiculite is a sort of a ground cork that you can get from the garden centre. And then once I'm happy that I've got the coverage that I want, I just go over it and give it a second coat of the hairspray. Set it to one side, and 10 minutes later it's dry. But you can use a hairdryer if you need to speed up the process, which is what I needed to do. The paint process needs to be quick and speedy, so I used the zenithal highlight so that I could ensure that the next step looks effective without too much effort. So I just wanted to interrupt the video for a moment to say that during the filming and editing of this video, my YouTube channel on the back end of the lava terrain video hit 250 subscribers. To see me hit 250 subscribers in this amount of time is, I'm so pleased, and I wanted to say a really big thank you to you for hitting that like button, for saying that you're enjoying the content, and of course for subscribing. And I can't give enough thanks to you, and of course to my patrons down here as well, who you know, make this worthwhile going for it. So a real big shout out to all of you who spend the time to come and say hi, and hit those little bits down there that make this channel work so well in going forward from now. Thank you so much, and you take care of yourselves, and I'll see you after this one. Take care. Bye. As a commercially working freelance artist, I tend to have artist materials on hand. So I've got this acrylic purple ink, but any ink would work here. Just make sure it's a strong mix with a good amount of pigment and fluid to ensure that it's going to flow to good effect. So you want to apply a pretty liberal dose of the pigment. The cellulose nature of the spray paint from the zenithal highlight will kind of almost repel the water-based ink. So that goes on to create this sort of mottled texture, which looks quite effective without much else done to it. The rest of the piece is actually wet blended, just using a mix of black and yellow to produce a variety of dark greens. While that's still wet, I take a nice light blue and I just still wet brush into those areas to add an accent colour to give it a more unnatural looking feel. And then adding a red, I can neutralise that colour somewhat and create a nice dark grey. So I'm not having to change my palette here at all. I'm just carrying on with the same paints whilst it's still wet. Especially as at this point I can feel that game session getting closer and closer and closer. Just to point though that this grey is set to complement the purple of the shroom heads themselves, the caps themselves. So we get a nice colour balance between the base and the top, with this cooler colour in the centre where the stems and the vegetation part are. And practically without taking a breath, I just jump into the pure yellow and start brushing that from the underside of the cap down along the stems and onto a little bit of the lower fungal vegetation, just to start producing a bit of a highlight from the glow that I want there. And I will just point out that this isn't intended to be some refined object source lighting, it is just a rough and ready application. I felt I'd got enough time to just still squeeze out a few more effects before having to place these on the table. So I decided I wanted to give the caps just a little bit more interest going on. So I'm mixing some of that light blue that I used in the stems, making sure it's sort of like a single cream consistency. I made a mask from a piece of card so that I could protect the rest of the base, and using a toothbrush, an old one, I used the spatter technique to add a speckled surface feature to the caps of the mushrooms. So I left everything by an open window for half an hour to dry whilst I went and worked on the evening's game notes. Came back and then applied a light grey dry brushing to all of the rock surfaces. With that done, it was a quick application of a nice dark wash. I actually used the violet ink from previous with a little bit of black ink in it to darken it still further. Similarly, I took a little yellow with some white in it and did a very light dry brush pass over the stems, again just to intensify the transition from rock into the more fungal growth. And I also worked around the root systems and some of that lower texture that was applied earlier with the vermiculite. Okay, I am on to the home run. It's back to that hairspray again and applying a little bit of my homemade flocking. Now ordinarily I would go on and paint this so that I'd got a little bit of variety of colour, but to be honest I just simply hadn't got time in this build. So I finished it off by sealing that flocking with another coat of hairspray, and that's pretty much the job done.